Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. Scholia are dense, tiny, sprawling ancient and medieval notes that hem in the manuscript margins of our classical texts. Scholia seem to occupy a kind of strange hidden in plain sight space in the field. These notes are sometimes our most direct link to how the ancients themselves read the same texts that we study, and yet we rarely teach students how to use and access them. By the time you hit grad school, you're somehow expected to know what they are, why they matter, and how to read them. But in reality, none of this is very intuitive, and a lot of it can be overwhelming and frustrating. When I was in graduate school, just starting my dissertation work, a book came out that made all this kind of information much more accessible. Eleanor Dickey's 2007 Ancient Greek Scholarship, a guide to finding, reading, and understanding Scholia, Commentaries, Lexica, and Grammatical Treatises from their beginnings to the Byzantine period. That book does just what it says on the tin. It serves as an inroad to the complex ancient scholarly traditions and provides practical advice about how to access them, right down to the standard editions. I remember that when I mentioned to one of my advisors how helpful I found Dickey's book, he agreed and noted with some awe that it was a remarkably altruistic work. In other words, Dickey had done a great service to the field, and especially to its younger practitioners like me, by offering an actual roadmap into these traditions. My guest for this episode, Bill Beck, has now also produced a remarkably altruistic work of scholarship. Bill is a member of a team that has a contract to produce a multi-volume translation of the Scholia to the first 12 books of the Iliad. Bill's translation of the Scholia to books 1 and 2 has recently appeared, and it's going to be an immensely useful resource for classicists of all levels of experience and for scholars in other fields whose work brings them into contact with the ancient scholarly traditions. Bill's own volume contains a lengthy introduction that surveys the general lay of the land when it comes to the Homeric Scholia. And in this episode, you're going to be hearing him explain just what the different kinds of Scholia are, what kinds of material they comment on, and what sorts of idiosyncrasies they have, at least from our perspective as modern readers of the Iliad. He'll also be letting us in on the unique challenges of translating Scholia, challenges that are quite a bit different from those of translating the Homeric poems themselves. By the way, if you are, however, interested in hearing more about the world of Homeric translation, let me just flag that we do have 2 Lesche episodes dedicated to it. Season 1, Episode 6, Translating the Iliad with Emily Wilson, and Season 1, Episode 15, Translating the Odyssey with Daniel Mendelsohn. Those, incidentally, are 2 of the podcast's most downloaded episodes. Bill Beck is an assistant professor of classical studies at Indiana University. His research focuses on archaic Greek epic and ancient Homeric scholarship. He is the co-editor of the Ancient Scholia to Homer's Iliad, Exegesis and Interpretation, which came out with Oxford in 2021, and the author of The Ancient Scholia to Homer's Iliad, a Translation, Volume 1, which appeared with Cambridge in 2025. He is currently completing a monograph on the Iliad's representation of the first 9 years of the Trojan War, provisionally entitled 10 Years in Troy, 51 Days at Ilios, The Iliad and the Trojan War. Just a quick note that I've put some references in the show notes for this episode, and yet another brief reminder that Lesche is on Instagram at Lesche Podcast, which is where I post announcements of new episodes, so consider giving us a follow there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Bill Beck. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
I was writing a dissertation on the Iliad, and I was interested in sort of the critical history of 2 ideas. I was interested in a lot, sort of too much in my dissertation, but at the time I was looking at 2 ideas. One of them was this idea that Achilles' absence from long stretches of the poem is a construction problem for the plot. And I was also interested in this idea that the question of what was happening for the first 9 years of the war. And I was looking at the critical history of both of these questions. And that took me to the, through all sorts of Homeric scholarship, it took me to the annalists. And then I thought, if I'm going to go back 200 years, maybe I'll go back even further. And so I became aware of the Scholia and started digging into them. And I pretty quickly realized I didn't really know what I was looking at. I wasn't sure of the date of a lot of the material I was looking at. I wasn't sure how they related to one another. I wasn't sure of its transmission history. And so sort of the further I got into my dissertation, even though it really didn't have very much to do with the Scholia at all, the more interested I became in the Scholia as a phenomenon. And when I tried to learn more about it, I found that most of the studies that were available were quite specialized to an extent that I found sort of difficult, as a graduate student, difficult for me to get a handle on what I was dealing with, especially because, this wasn't my primary research area. I was writing a dissertation, I had my hands full already. So I was sort of looking for something quick to just give me a sort of a guide through the Scholia, and I wasn't exactly finding that. So I thought, the best way to get to grips with this corpus would be to translate it. And obviously that was not something I could do just on the side while writing my dissertation. I mean, I did in graduate school, I had some wonderful colleagues and we were able to put together a little reading group of Scholia in breaks from dissertation writing. But, that didn't last. It didn't get us too far through the corpus. But so I applied for a Fulbright working with Dickey, who was so supportive of this project and really, really helpful in all phases of it. And very fortunate to get that. Went to the UK for a year, worked on the translation to book 1 of the Scholia, completed that, and at that point, Eleanor told me, you should really apply for you should really write a proposal for a contract. So I did that, and in the process of writing the proposal and talking with the editor, I realized that other people where I was living in Oxford at the time, and Adrian Kelly, Oliver Thomas, and Tom Phillips had already had a plan to produce a translation of the Scholia to the Iliad. So Eleanor put me in touch with them, and then the result of that was that the 4 of us were going to team up to translate the first 4 books, the Scholia to the first 4 books of the Iliad, which to my chagrin at the time meant that I was going to have to translate not just book 1, but the second book of the Scholia. And I thought, I don't know when I'm going to find the time to do this because I need to finish my dissertation, etc. But then I went to Athens for 2 years on fellowships with the American School, finished the Scholia to book 2, and so was able to do the bulk of the work sort of in my graduate years, and then coming back to it recently to finally revise it. So now, Adrian Kelly was involved in the first volume. He's now stepped aside. I think he has many, many other projects. And we've brought in Charlie Baker, who's finishing his DPhil at Oxford right now. And so the 4 of us will have a contract to produce the first 4 volumes, which will take us through the first 12 books of the Iliad. I do want to keep working on the Scholia beyond that, but I think we'll sort of sit tight to let the other volumes come out first.
Yeah, that makes sense. It kind of reminds me, what you're saying about the time investment, it's sort of like this idea that you get into Thucydides that you can't just develop a navy on the side. It sort of, exactly. It leaves you, in fact, it leaves you no room to do anything else at all.
Yeah, it's sort of what I found with this, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, could you, for the listeners, maybe begin by just explaining, since you, as you noted, it is hard to dip your toe into the Scholia. And I will say that Eleanor Dickey's volume on the transmission of ancient texts and the ancient scholarly apparatus around the text is probably, is a hugely helpful resource for people who are looking to start here. But maybe you could just say a few words about what this corpus or what these corpora look like. When we say the Scholia, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, so a couple of ways of answering that. So I guess the most basic answer is that the Scholia that we have you can think about how they're presented on the page and how we actually have them today. We have them primarily as marginal and interlinear comments on medieval manuscripts of the Iliad. But the more important factor that we're generally concerned with is the origins of these Scholia and how they come onto those places in the manuscripts. And these, when we're talking about Scholia, typically we're talking about extracts of ancient scholarship that are compiled in antiquity or in late antiquity, compiled again and again and again, and eventually transmitted as Scholia in the manuscripts that we have. So for the Iliad Scholia, there are a couple ways of breaking them up. I talk about this in the introduction, but you can break them up just basically by age. So we have the Scholia Recentiora, or basically Scholia from the Byzantine period, especially 10th century onwards, or the Scholia Vetera, the Old Scholia, which is Scholia that has roots in antiquity. And those terms are very vague, which can be useful and a little bit confusing as well. But for the Scholia vetera, which is the Scholia that I work with, typically they're also broken down in terms of the sort of Scholia. So we have Scholia Maiora, the greater Scholia, which generally refers to the so-called grammatical Scholia. And then there's the Scholia Minora, which generally refers to the D Scholia, and I'll talk about each of these in a second. But Scholia Maiora, this is what Erbse in his 7-volume edition of the Scholia is editing. And this has 2 components. There's what's known as the VMK, which is from a German acronym for the 4-man commentary. And then there's the exegetical class of Scholia. The 4-man commentary basically consists of a compilation of 4 scholars from between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century CE, all of whom were very important in establishing the constitution of the Homeric text. This exegetical Scholia are a compilation of 2 or 3, perhaps more, commentaries of their quote-unquote exegetical nature. So these are commentaries that are interested primarily not in what is the reading of the text, but what does the text mean? Why is the text saying this? What is the motivation for the character to do this, etc.
So the more literary critical that we might think
exactly.
of it in that way. Okay.
The kinds of questions that I think most readers tend to be interested in is provided by the exegetical Scholia. Whereas if you're a textual critic, you definitely want to go to the VMK or this 4-man commentary. The other branch is the Scholia Minora, which is also sometimes referred to as the D Scholia. And the D Scholia is another compilation that has all these different component parts coming from different places and different times. So the base of the D Scholia is the glossary of the Homeric poem, which is to say they go through nearly every word of the Iliad and tell you its Koine equivalent. These are really interesting because you can see that it has roots in the ancient, like the classical classroom, where that's how you're learning, you're learning how to parse the Iliad is the way that you're learning language. So we have the glossary, we have a collection of zetemata, so literary critical questions about the Iliad. Why is the word Manus the first word of the poem? Why does Chryses curse the Trojans? These kinds of questions. And then you have the mythographus Homericus, is a writer who tries to explain all the mythological references in the Iliad. So that gets incorporated into this compilation. And then we have the hypotheses, the summaries of all the books of the Iliad. So someone in late antiquity takes all those component parts together and puts them into a new compilation that becomes the basis of the D Scholia. So one of the things that makes the Scholia difficult is just we're looking at so many different sources from so many different time periods. And in the process of compilation, a lot changes. And a lot of these things get fused together and mixed around. So it makes it a little bit difficult to figure out what's what.
What is the earliest scholarship that seems to be absorbed into this tradition?
The earliest scholarship that leaves a real impression on the Scholia is probably that of Xenocrates of Ephesus. So this is the producer of one of the first critical editions of the Iliad. Unfortunately, he didn't leave a commentary with his edition, so all we have is his edition with the critical sign that he invented to attend that edition, and that was the obelus, so a little line. And that line he used to represent verses that he didn't believe belonged in the text. So Xenocrates is chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. But going back a little bit further, we hear of, the texts of the editions of Rhianus of Crete or Antimachus of Colophon, but, they're such shadowy figures in terms of what we hear about them in their editions or their texts of the Iliad. And then I suppose the oldest component of the Scholia you could regard as the glossographic component of the D Scholia. So all of those, synonyms basically that are being provided, because those have early roots. But I think the version that we have is certainly inflected by a later compiler as well.
So in terms of the 4-man commentary, the VMK, Aristarchus is not one of the 4 men, but he's clearly important for that tradition. Could you say a little bit about Aristarchus and his Homeric scholarship?
Yeah, so Aristarchus is the big name that I've certainly left out. So he sort of looms behind the VMK. So, and you can get a sense of that if you look into what are the specific sources of the VMK that we have. So the earliest 2 are Didymus and Aristonicus. And so Didymus writes a work called on the Aristarchian recension. So he's just looking at the editions of Aristarchus on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he's saying, what are the choices that Aristarchus made, and how do those relate to other editions that we have? Aristonicus has a work called On the Critical Signs of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So what he's doing there is he's looking at Aristarchus's commentaries, and he's explaining why Aristarchus made certain annotations in his text. So those two are huge sources for us, for our ability to recreate Aristarchus's scholarship, which we do not have surviving in its original form. And then we have Nicanor, who writes a text on the punctuation of Homer, and he's sort of coming from the school of Aristarchus, but not exactly Aristarchian in the sense of Didymus and Aristonicus. And then Herodian is the fourth component, and he works on the accentuation and pronunciation of the Homeric text.
Yeah, actually, I have a question about Nicanor, which is that I was just struck in your introduction by this line where you mentioned that Nicanor worked in the field of punctuation. And he got this. A lot of these guys have these wonderful nicknames, including Didymus, of course. But in the case of Nicanor, his work in the punctuation studies earns him this nickname, Ostigmatias, the punctuator. Could you maybe explain to me a little bit, why is punctuation such a big deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a big deal in ways that I found out when working on the translation, because I feel like, we're so used to our edited texts that we can forget all of the ambiguities that are possible if you're reading a text that has no punctuation and potentially, no spaces, no word divisions. But when you're looking at the Iliad through the eyes of one of these critics, you're alive to all sorts of possibilities of meaning and implications that you want to avoid. So I can't really think of very specific examples, but there are certain cases where, if you don't put a comma here, you could have a certain implication that speaks very negatively toward Agamemnon, or just giving the wrong impression of something. Or, probably the most important case is if you think of the proem to the Iliad, and you think of the phrase Dios de telea tabulae, and the will of Zeus was fulfilled. The question is, how do we take that, right? Do we take that with the preceding line, or the preceding part of the line, in which humans are being made into food for animals? Is that the will of Zeus being fulfilled? Or do we have to take it with what goes next? Zeus's will was being fulfilled from the time when Achilles and Agamemnon began to quarrel. That's a matter of punctuation. It's also obviously a matter of interpretation, but the editor, by punctuating the text a certain way, gets to decide how we will be disposed to take that passage.
So these four men of the VMK commentary, or the VMK tradition here, they're working between Alexandria and Rome, our main centers of scholarship. So how then does their work get picked apart and constituted as scholia? Like, at what point do we think that people are going to these various commentaries, monographs, and then annotating the text around the page in this way?
This is a big question that I don't have a precise answer to. I think some point between the 4th and 6th century is most likely that someone is wanting to compile all the major works of textual criticism, especially going back to Aristarchus, on the Iliad. And so they choose these 4 authors, which makes sense. It covers the editions of Aristarchus, the commentaries of Aristarchus, and then punctuation and accentuation. And so they compile all of those works together at some point, maybe 5th, 6th century CE, into a sort of super compilation. And then that becomes the basis from one of the core components of the Scholia.
So is the transition from scroll or roll to codex an important part of that story, do you think, or is that incidental?
I would say almost certainly it is, but I do not have enough knowledge to answer that, yeah.
Well, could you also maybe say a few words about what do we find on papyrus in terms of this kind of scholarship?
Yeah, so we find some really interesting things on papyrus for the way that they relate to what we have in the Scholia. So we have a papyrus from, I think now, is it the 5th century CE, that seems to be basically an abridged version of one of the sources of the exegetical scholia. That's showing us that the exegetical scholia, which are likely coming from commentaries written in the 1st to 4th century CE. We really can't be very precise. But one of those commentaries is in circulation in the 5th century and being extracted and sort of summarized as a separate commentary that's circulated on papyrus. We also have commentaries on papyrus, both just whole text commentaries and also commentaries that are marginal alongside the text of the Iliad from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, 2nd and 1st centuries BC and beyond, telling us about the scholarship of Aristarchus. So one of the commentaries that I translate in the translation is very engaged with the scholarship of Aristarchus specifically. Is talking about what he has in his editions, what he says in his commentaries. So it's not exactly related to the sources of our Scholia, but you can see clearly a relation between them.
So when you're copying a manuscript, it seems like it's kind of an easier project logistically in some ways to add little annotations around the side than it is with a printed book. But could you maybe say a little bit about the history of printed editions of Scholia in modernity?
Sure. So, yeah, this really begins in 1788 with the first printed edition of the Venatus A and the Venatus B. So the Venatus A, or A, is our best witness to the VMK Scholia, and the Venatus B is one of the main witnesses, especially to the exegetical Scholia. So when this comes out in 1788, this is a huge deal for the history of Homeric scholarship, largely because of the way that especially a scholar like F.A. Wolf responds to it. And for him, I mean, we might talk about this a little bit later, but for Wolf, the Scholia are a really important insight into the ability of the ancient critics, and he regards that as, he doesn't hold them in very high regard, and also about the state of our texts in antiquity. And for him, this is further confirmation that these texts were highly unstable, is how he sees them. And so I think he refers to them as, he says the ancient critics disagree to an extraordinary extent on the constitution of the text. From my perspective, so, if we're looking into the question of what the Scholia can tell us about the text of the Iliad, there are sort of two perspectives on this, going back from Wolf. The perspective of the hardcore oralist would be that what we see in the Scholia, the variations that we see there, or the variants, are the kind of last gasp of the tradition of oral composition and performance, that when we see variations in wording or in case or what have you, that those are evidence of the kind of final stage of oral composition. For another scholar, maybe a more sort of textually inclined scholar like myself, I see this as kind of the opposite, as sort of the indication of the remarkable stability of the text by the early Hellenistic period. And when I think about, the question of the textual stability of the Iliad, this is sort of a dated reference, but I sometimes think of maybe 5-10 years ago, there was that internet phenomenon of the dress of two different colors. Is it blue or is it gold? And I feel like scholars of different persuasions see the textual variability attested to by the Iliad Scholia, rather. And some of them will say this shows clearly that the poem was being performed in composition orally to quite a late date, whereas other scholars would say the exact opposite, looking at the exact same evidence. And, it just shows you the different lens through which scholars are looking at these texts.
And as with the dress, people don't really tend to change their opinion.
Exactly, yeah. Different lenses.
So what then, in terms of modern editions of the Scholia, what is your source text that you're working with? What is the edition that you translated from?
So I worked with Hartmut Erbse's 7-volume edition of the Scholia Maiora. And so what he's trying to do there is reproduce the archetypes of two branches of manuscripts. He's trying to reproduce the archetype of the Venatus A, and he's trying to reproduce the archetype of BT, So the B manuscripts and the T manuscripts, and the archetype he calls C. So he's trying, in his edition, is trying to get back to those archetypes. In our team, we also wanted to sort of go a bit beyond Erbse because Erbse, understandably, his volume is 3,000 pages long. He had to be a little bit selective. So he cut out almost all of the D Scholia. And we wanted to bring some of that in, but of course it doesn't make sense to translate all of the D Scholia because most of it is glossaries, and you can't translate two synonyms into English very effectively. So we cut that out, but we brought in all of the Scholia from the Mythographus Homericus and most of the Zetemata. So in the translation, even if something isn't in the main text, I usually have put it in the footnote. And so for the D Scholia, I'm largely using the addition of Van Til.
What were the principles that you agreed upon as a team for how your translation would actually look on the page? Because it seems like there were probably a lot of choices that went into that.
There were so many choices. And I would say we met several times and we always made ground rules that as soon as we made them, I then broke, because I found one of the main struggles with this was just trying to be consistent, because you can try to make a rule, but then you realize actually the reader really needs to see this, or really needs to know this, or this has to be shown in Greek, there needs to be a footnote here. I would say, yeah, that was one of the biggest struggles in dealing with the translation, is just trying to stay consistent, because, for my own sanity, for our own sanity, I think we wanted to just have certain ground rules. We're always going to do this way. But in practice, it was very, very hard to hold on to. So there was a lot of dialogue with the members of the editorial team, but unfortunately, it was always a case-by-case basis.
Well, could you say maybe a bit about also your principles of translation? I mean, what was your strategy? What kind of register were you going for? I mean, I think of these translation sort of schools of thought about, foreignization versus domestication, and, sort of how naturally are you trying to render this, or how much are you kind of trying to keep some sense of word order of the original, right? Those kinds of things. What were some of the principles of translation?
Yeah, it's difficult because, the Scholia it's not trying to be an elegant text. So it's hard to translate it. A text that's meant for people with a lot of background knowledge, it's hard to reproduce that in a way that is intelligible. One thing I really did struggle with was the way to translate the Homeric text itself, because often in English, we're not going to reproduce every single word in the Iliad, every ara or de or te or, any of these particles. However, in the Scholia, they're often talking about just a singular particle. And so you have to translate that, you give the Greek as well, but generally you want to show what they're talking about to an audience that might not have Greek. So it means that I had to be super literal when translating Homer to a degree that I didn't love. But, nobody's coming to me for a translation of the Iliad. That's obviously not why they're reading this. So I thought, it's okay for me to be overly literal there. With the Scholia itself, I mean, I think a lot of my translation practice changed dramatically over the course of my time working on it. When I started, I was a graduate student, and I think my translation reflected that in many ways, because I was eager to show, the audience for my translation from the very beginning was Eleanor Dickey, in that I was presenting her drafts and wanted, she really didn't know me very well, of course, at the start of it, and so I wanted to prove to her that I knew every single word and knew how the optative works and how the subjunctive works and all of that. And so I was sort of overly literal in the beginning. And of course, I moved away from that. And so, draft after draft after draft, I realized actually this just needs to be readable is the primary focus there. And I think in general, the audience I had in mind was a sort of graduate or undergraduate student who, wouldn't necessarily need to know Greek, but probably knows some Greek in order to make this useful to them. And all of my decisions were basically made with that audience in mind. But of course, inevitably you have multiple audiences in mind all the time, as I'm sure you've experienced.
As you were translating, did you find yourself at any point, feeling like you entered into particular disagreement with what the scholiast was saying? Or
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that was another challenge, is that sometimes they take words in very different ways from how we typically take them. So in the proem of the Iliad, there's the verb pro-iopsen, which we would translate as hurled forth, or, pro-iopto. And they translate it as pro, before, and iopto, to harm. So something that is harmed prematurely. So these heroes were sort of sent to Hades before their time, before they ought to have died. And of course, things like that present challenges, because do I translate the lemma inaccurately? And if so, then I have to place a footnote explaining, like, yeah, the word actually means something different, but this is how the critic is understanding it. So there's difficulties like that all the time, where the critics they're taking, either they're construing words differently than we do, they're taking phrases together that we would take apart, or vice versa. So yeah, disagreements, minor and major, all the time.
In terms of the exegetical scholia, what we were talking about is the more literary critical scholia, or the more, that's how they might read tests today. What kind of major concerns do you see the scholias having in those notes?
Yeah, the exegetical scholia are really interesting because they seem to be interested in every aspect of interpretation. And one of the things I find fascinating about them is that they are willing to ask all sorts of questions that really wouldn't even occur to us. Asking why about why does Homer make this choice? Why does a character make this choice? And I think that often, that can result in some facile interpretations, but it often results in some really interesting ideas that really hadn't occurred to me before in some cases. In general, they are very didactic in their orientation. So they're really wanting to teach their reader, or they're wanting to claim that Homer is an educator. And so, of course, there's this idea in antiquity that Homer is the educator of the Greeks. He's the greatest poet and therefore the greatest educator. But I think the exegetical critics take this idea really seriously. And so I've gone through as much of the corpus as I can and tried to collect as many of the lessons on the text as I could. And they have over 300 lessons that they pull out from the Iliad, and 250 of them are ethical lessons. So, a major problem that, interpreters of the Iliad dealt with for a long time is, how do we make this poem that is, extremely violent, full of impulsive characters, how do we make this conducive to the morality of, our readers today? And one of the ways the exegetical scholia did that is, by sort of arguing positively for the didactic orientation of the text. So every sort of detail you can imagine, they're willing to pull out and say, Homer is trying to show us something here. So, the second death in the Iliad, the Greek who dies, or an Achaean who dies because he's bending down to despoil the corpse of Acapolis, I think it is. And it says he bends down and exposes his ribs, and so then he gets killed as a result. And so through this, Homer shows us that we should always be careful. So, any opportunity to extract a lesson, they're going to take that. And they can also do that with negative exempla, or rather with positive exempla. So, if somebody prays successfully, this shows us the power of prayer. And so, they go through the text and just draw out as many lessons as they possibly can.
I've worked with the tragic scholia a little bit, and I know that there you get a lot of, there's even particular symbols that they use in a tragedy when there's a referent to a sort of a part of a Homeric poem, and they pull in Homer a lot there. But, since these scholars are obviously, working in a later tradition and have awareness of these other texts, are they also thinking with other texts? Do they bring in parallels or allusions or anything from tragedy or anything else?
Absolutely, they do. So there's a lot of tragedy, certainly. There's a good bit of Aristophanes. I'm thinking, though, that most of the time that I can think of when they're bringing in quotations, it's usually to show similarity or difference in usage. So, they have this idea that, quote unquote, Attic authors omit lots of words. And so Aristophanes will be their example for that. And so they say, if Homer is omitting words here, he's using an Attic manner of speech. And then they'll quote Aristophanes to show that you don't need to you can just some words can be implied.
So are they using Aristophanes to think of as colloquial Atticism, basically?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That's how I see it.
Okay. One thing that also comes up is the interest or the commitment that the exegetical critics have to seeing a mimetic quality of the Homeric text, that Homer is matching his poetic form to the content of the poetry. Could you say a little bit about that interest of theirs?
Yeah, I love this feature of the Exegetical Scholia. So one thing they like to point out is, yes, exactly this, that Homer is not just producing beautiful poetry, but he's also, using his sounds, his rhythms, the word order to reproduce the content in some way, to sort of bring the world of the poem into the world of the reader more directly. And so my favorite examples of this, and sort of the most surprising to me at the time, were with Mimesis. So, of course, and just various aspects of Homeric poetry, Homeric diction that we would just take to be, a part of the oral tradition or sort of metrical convenience, things like that. So for them, Mimesis always had the possibility to be mimetic in some way. So if we have a simile, there's a simile where somebody butchers an ox and the poet says tame dia rather than dia tame. And so they say, well, he's doing to the word exactly what the person in the simile is doing to the ox. Another case is where the Trojans are crossing the ditch in terror and fear of the Achaeans. And the Greek has dia, and then in Greek, the ditch and the stakes. And then it has ebeson. So instead of diebeson, they break up the constituent parts. And so here they say, yeah, the words are being thrown into confusion in the same way that the Trojans are thrown into confusion as they cross the ditch. We also see this with rhythm, or rather with meter. So there's the most famous case is in Book 12, when the Trojans are looking up at the sky and an eagle drops down a snake out of nowhere, and the snake is just writhing in front of them. And famously, that line ends one syllable too short. At least in our texts, it does. And so the critics say, well, this is intentional. Homer is trying to cause consternation in the reader to reflect the consternation of the Trojans at seeing this writhing snake. So you get all sorts of examples like that. We have it with, just like dactylic rhythms. If something is moving quickly, they'll call attention to the fact that Homer is writing in a dactylic line to reproduce the speed. So I think this is something that critics are still interested in doing today, is, thinking about the sound quality of the Iliad and the Odyssey and how that might be reproducing the content. But what we see in the Exegetical Scholia is just that ratcheted up really, really to a strong degree.
Kind of like these undergraduate close reading assignments where then
absolutely
people see alliteration everywhere.
Yes.
Do you get any sense from the Scholia of the personality of the scholars at all? Do we have any moments of something that might read as sarcasm or humor? Or I remember from working on tragedy that there was kind of an idea that Didymus was a little bit grumpy. Do we really get any of that?
I would say that for the scholars of the VMK, it's very hard to get a read on personality when they're really just saying, this is the correct reading. And they don't really give a lot more than that. For the Exegetical Scholia, obviously you can get more of a sense of the way that they're approaching a problem, the way they're thinking through the text, in the kinds of interests that they have. I mean, clearly the sources of the Exegetical Scholia, one of the things they're very interested in is piety. So most of the lessons they draw out from the Iliad are about proper worship of the gods. So clearly they're taking that very seriously. They praise Achilles every time he prays to Zeus, or when he listens to Athena. These are all lessons for us to be pious and to worship the gods correctly. Another thing at least some of these exegetical scholars are interested in, is the superiority of the Greeks over the other nations, certainly. And so that's one of the lessons they read into the Iliad, that this is Greeks against barbarians, which is showing us the superiority of the Greeks in pretty much all ways. So, I mean, you don't get a strong sense of their personality apart from what you might expect of, a privileged man in the 2nd century CE.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking more it's like a salty Irish monk thing on the Latin side. Maybe I have that in mind.
Yeah,
I'm sort of hoping for that.
Less like snark.
Yeah.
Less of that, certainly, unfortunately.
Okay. Was there anything in reading the Scholia so carefully, that with the care that translation requires, did you find your mind changed about anything, in the Iliad, particularly books 1 and 2, but maybe more broadly, even the Homeric poetry more broadly?
I think certainly in small ways. The one that comes to mind would be in the beginning of book 2. I guess I'm not sure actually what the critical consensus on Agamemnon's speech to the troops is in Iliad Book 2. But, certainly my reading on that had always been that Agamemnon is being shown there to have a bad handle on his army and to be really misreading them. The critics, even though they're willing to praise Agamemnon in various ways, they are also critical of him. They regard his speech to the troops. So this is, Iliad Book 2, Agamemnon gets the dream, telling him that he can take Ilios now. And then he tells his advisors that he's going to tell the troops the opposite. And he wants them to restrain them if they flee. So then he gives the speech saying, we all just need to go home. This is a lost cause. I've been deceived by Zeus. And the critics are very interesting for the way they read that speech because they're always looking for double meanings. And it reminds me of the way that we're more used to reading speeches in the Odyssey, where, when we see Odysseus speaking in Nausicaa, you realize he's sort of communicating two things at once, whether he's talking to a goddess or whether he's talking to a human girl. And in Agamemnon's speech, they're looking for these double meanings that on the surface, he's saying, let's go home. But he's not saying, let's go home. He's saying, let's flee. And therefore, he's trying to show his troops this would be a dishonorable choice. And so they go through the speech, picking out those details that are showing us, actually, Agamemnon is really cleverly trying to get them to see that this is not the right move, that they should actually want to stay, which I'm not sure I entirely agree with it, but I think it's a very productive line of interpretation that Agamemnon actually has a decent rhetorical strategy rather than just a total misread of his army. And it's just that his army has failed to see his, sort of double messaging.
Earlier, you were mentioning how the Scholia see this as a very tendentious poem in favor of the Greeks, which is a reading, I think, that stands at odds with contemporary readings.
Yeah.
But then also, it's really interesting, this question of Agamemnon. I think it came up even for me just this semester where graduate students were saying that they don't understand why there is such a robust tradition from antiquity that sees him as such a great leader when on their reading, he's like a total wet blanket in the Iliad. So maybe the Scholia are providing some insight into ways that you could read it a little bit more sympathetically. So it's a really interesting point. Well, I'm wondering, what are you hoping that readers will get out of this translation? Who are you envisioning as your readership? What do you think it might enable people to do that they weren't able to do without a translation?
Yeah, so I think, there's a CCC panel going on this summer about the connections between Ancient Scholia, and I think specifically maybe the Homeric Scholia, and other, not even just scholarly traditions, but just other products, cultural products from the imperial period. And so one of the things I'm hoping is that we'll just be able to see how people are, one, how we can situate this Scholia in its intellectual and cultural context, and how readers, how poets, how other critics are using this Scholia. One thing that, Renee Nünlist's book certainly does a good job of doing, but I think there's room for more of this, is showing the connections between how scholars are viewing tragedy or comedy against how they're reading the Iliad.
So this is Nünlist's ancient critic at work, right?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. There's a lot of connections to be made because presumably many of these scholars are the same scholars or, are certainly in conversation with one another, reading one another's works. So it'd be interesting to see, how different traditions are using this material. In terms of who I see reading this, certainly undergraduates and graduate students in classical studies who do not have the time to sit down and read the Iliad Scholia, but I think it enlivens the texts that we have by bringing out new questions that we would not ever have thought to consider before.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, for people whose main focus is not Greek, but are interested in these points of contact, like in, Augustan, early imperial Rome, I think it'll be really great. Also, there's been that work lately, maybe not so lately, but in the last couple of decades on the Homeric exegesis and the origins of rabbinic tradition in Alexandria.
Yeah, absolutely. These traditions are so interconnected in Alexandria at the time. Also, I mean, just speaking to the Latin side of things, I mean, I know Joe Farrell was one of my professors at Penn, and one of the things he sometimes talked about, and I know he wrote about, was the fact that Servius, in his commentary on the Aeneid, seems to have been looking at Homeric Scholia, Homeric scholarship as he had it available to him then, as a kind of model for how he was going to be commenting on the Aeneid. So that's just another area that hopefully could be opened up considerably by a translation.
Well, I think it's a fantastic resource to have, and I think it'll be great to actually be able to, as you're suggesting, to teach with this, even undergraduates, for them to get a sense of the tradition. It's going to be hugely useful. I have been winding down each episode of the podcast this season, Bill, by asking people sort of amid current circumstances, is there anything that you, in your off time, not that Homeric Scholia leaves you a huge amount of off time, but that you've been reading or listening to or watching or doing that has been bringing you some joy?
Yeah, sure. So one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to these days is called Totalis Rankium. And it's a little bit silly, but it is two British primary school teachers who go through, they have two series. One is on the Roman emperors, both Western and Eastern. And they go through and they have an episode on every single Roman emperor from the beginning to 1453. And they give basically an hour or 2 hours on each emperor, regardless of how short their reign is. And they have a very silly sense of humor, but it's actually extremely effective at getting across the history that many of us have never gotten. There's so many areas of Roman history that one cannot cover in a lifetime. They also have a spin-off series on the American presidents, and I have to say it has been very illuminating to see the history of poor presidents we have had from the beginning. So those have been fun and illuminating listens at the same time.
Bill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and congratulations on the appearance of this volume. We're going to be looking forward here to future installments in the series. And it was great chatting with you. I learned a lot both from looking at the book and from talking to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.